Welcome everyone to the Fair Housing and Power Hour on Fair Housing for Local Governments. My name is Brittany Mellinger. I'm the Fair Housing Training and Outreach Coordinator at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Before we get started, I do want to let you know that this program is being recorded. I put a statement in the chat about the Wiretap Act, and it is against the law in Pennsylvania to record oral conversations without the permission of the folks involved in most circumstances. And consent to recording. This session is being recorded for training and/or record-keeping purposes. By participating in this session, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and use of this session. And at any time, if you have a question or comment, please feel free to place that in the chat and we will respond to you as soon as possible. If you would like to ask your question or to comment verbally, please note that by doing so, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and use of your statements recorded as part of this session. And thank you to everyone who said a quick hello in the chat. For those of you just joining, please feel free to put your name and where you're joining us from in the chat. It's always helpful to know who's part of the session today and where you're coming from. So this is part of our Fair Housing and Power Hour series. It's a monthly webinar that's open to everyone and covers the basics of fair housing. So today we're scheduled to run from 12 to 1 p.m. And we're going to be talking about fair housing for local governments. We typically are able to provide ASL and captioning for these sessions, and I sincerely apologize, but we are not able to do that today. So just to make you aware that that will not be available during today's session. After the session, I will send out the recording for anyone who missed it and wasn't able to attend, and I will also send out the slides and materials from today's program as well. So thank you so much for joining us. And let's jump in. So fair housing is the right of everyone in Pennsylvania. At the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, we believe this very strongly because housing is so central to opportunities in our state. Housing can impact the schools that your kids go to, the job opportunities that are nearby, the transportation opportunities, the air you drink, the water you breathe, and it impacts so many areas of our lives. So we really put a lot of focus and attention on making sure that everyone is aware of their housing rights and responsibilities and the protections in our law. I want to provide you a quick roadmap from where we're headed today. We're going to start out with an overview of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. We will identify relevant fair housing laws and protected classes. We'll discuss the role of local governments in fostering housing opportunities, and we will close out our program by providing an overview of the complaint process at PHRC. Throughout the presentation, I hope that I will be able to answer your fair housing questions. So if you have thoughts or questions, input to share, I really encourage you to put that in the chat or to raise your hand if you'd like to participate verbally, but I will also save a few minutes at the end for any questions that you'd like to ask. And I also have a quick engagement acknowledgement and the information, materials, and/or technical assistance are intended solely as informal guidance and are neither a determination of your legal rights or responsibilities under the PHRA and/or applicable federal laws, nor binding on any agency with enforcement responsibility under those same laws. So the PHRC, we are the state's leading civil rights enforcement agency, making sure that Pennsylvanians can live, work, and learn free from unlawful discrimination. We've been around since 1955, so it's our 70th anniversary this year, and we work to accomplish our work through a two-part mission. We enforce Pennsylvania's non-discrimination laws, which include both the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, as well as the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. So if someone believes that they've experienced discrimination in their housing or in any of the other areas of our work, they can file a complaint and have a neutral investigator look into the situation. But we don't just wait for complaints to come in. We actively promote equal opportunity for all in Pennsylvania. We do that through training programs such as this one. We host events and conferences, virtual presentations and conversations, and we also have advisory councils throughout the state, which actively work to promote awareness of community members' rights and to work with PHRC to resolve issues that surround equal opportunity in our state. We serve the entire state of Pennsylvania, and we do that through 3 regional offices. So you can see the map on the screen there in the dark blue on the western part of the state. That's the territory that's served by our Pittsburgh regional office. In the central part of the state, in that light blue, that is served by our Harrisburg regional office. And then in the medium blue on the right-hand side of your screen, that's served by our Philadelphia regional office. Those are the offices that do a lot of the work that's so central to the mission of the PHRC in doing intake and conducting investigations. We also have a central office that does outreach and administrative functions as well. I mentioned our 2 laws, and I just want to make sure that I cover what they all entail. So you can see that the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act really does a lot of the heavy lifting for our agency. It covers issues in employment, in housing, in commercial property, as well as public accommodations, and primary and secondary education up through high school. The Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act extends that coverage into post-secondary education, such as colleges, trade schools, and technical schools. We're going to have our focus on housing today, but if you want any further information about our work in other spaces, you can go on our website to get that information as well. But we're going to start out with our fair housing laws. I'd love for anyone who would like to participate in the chat to enter into the chat what you think our fair housing laws try to do. Why are they in place? What are they trying to accomplish? Why do we have our fair housing laws? Is there anyone that would like to venture any thoughts or guesses? Anyone want to venture any guesses on the role or purpose of our fair housing laws? Thanks, OC level. Prevent discrimination. Absolutely. That's a huge part of it. Avoiding discrimination and providing equal opportunities. Absolutely. Thank you so much for participating in that way. At the PHRC, we talk about fair housing as having 2 goals. So first, goal number 1, ending housing discrimination, making sure that no one is kept out of housing because of discrimination. But fair housing goals go beyond that. Goal number 2 is promoting diverse, inclusive communities. That's known as Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, or AFFH. So there's been a lot of discussion around the definition of AFFH, and that's changed over the past few years. Under the previous administration, it was defined as taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities that are free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity based on protected characteristics. Now, that's changed, and earlier this year, under the interim final rule, it was defined as to take any action rationally related to promoting any attribute or attributes of fair housing. PHRC did release a statement on that, and you can certainly find that on our website if you're looking to know more. But I think the heart of the matter is that for many years, we've had discriminatory laws and practices and policies that have limited housing opportunities. And those have really shaped what housing looks like in our communities and who can access it. So there's a lot of active work that we need to do to promote diverse, inclusive communities, and that's going to be a lot of our conversation today. But before we get into that, I want to cover the nuts and bolts of fair housing and the basics. So it covers the sale and rental of housing, as well as housing-related transactions. The types of housing that are covered by our fair housing laws, it includes apartments, single-family homes, manufactured housing communities, condominiums, public housing, nursing homes, dormitories, and more. There's even some types of shelters that are covered by our fair housing laws. There are a number of different parties that are responsible to know and abide by our fair housing laws, and it's really anyone that has power and authority in housing decisions, and it's controlling access to housing for individuals. So it could be property owners and municipal officials and other local government officials, lenders, realtors, and more. There's two main discrimination theories or types of discrimination that I'd like to discuss today. So the first one is disparate treatment. That's treatment that directly discriminates against a member of a protected class. So for example, looking at the protected class of disability, that could look like someone with a disability going to view a unit and being told by the property manager that they don't think that the unit is safe for the individual based on their disability and denying them that housing. Treatment that directly discriminates against a member of a protected class based on that protected class. Disparate impact can be a little bit trickier to spot. So that's a policy that's neutral on its face, but it has that disparate or disproportionate impact on a member of a protected class. So looking again at the protected class of disability, that could be a housing provider's rule that everyone to qualify for housing at that property, it needs to have full-time employment. So we know that statistically, individuals with disabilities are more likely to have part-time employment or income from other sources. So a rule like this would disproportionately impact this group of individuals and keep them out of housing opportunities. So it could have that disparate impact. We have three different layers of fair housing laws. At the federal level, there's the Fair Housing Act of 1968. There's also Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which adds additional protections for federally subsidized properties. There's also the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, the ADA, which provides additional protections for individuals with disabilities. At the state level, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, the PHRA, that provides the basis for our state protections. And then at the local level, there are many different local ordinances throughout our state that provide additional protections beyond what's offered at the federal or state level. So often in local ordinances, there's protected classes that aren't included under our federal and our state protections. I'd love to hear if anyone lives or works in an area with a local human relations ordinance or a local human relations commission. If you would put that in the chat, I'm always curious to see who's familiar with their local ordinances. All right, thanks so much, Kimberly. Abington Township has an HRC, absolutely, and Montco. Fantastic, thank you so much. For housing jurisdiction, I want to cover about differences in covered providers. So under the Federal Fair Housing Act, housing providers with 4 or more properties need to abide by fair housing laws unless they publicly advertise their vacancies or receive federal funding. So there's an exemption for housing providers with 3 or fewer properties, but there can be no discrimination in advertisements, and housing providers that receive federal funding need to also comply with their federal fair housing laws. Under the PHRA, our state law, housing providers with 1 or more properties need to comply, so there isn't that same exemption for small landlords. The filing timeline also looks a little bit different for our state and our federal protections. So for the Federal Fair Housing Act, complaints need to be filed with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development within 365 days of the date of the last harm, so within the year. Under the state Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, complaints need to be filed within 180 days of the date of the last harm, so about 6 months. So there's a little bit of a shorter timeline if you're looking to file with our agency. And I see in the chat that Berks County also has a local HRC, so thank you so much for adding that into the discussion. Now, I've mentioned protected classes already in the presentation, and that's groups of individuals that have protections under our fair housing laws. Um, I have the lists of these protected classes at the federal and the state level on my next slide, but I always like to see how many of those we can cover in the chat. So I'd like to invite anyone who is familiar with any protected classes in housing to pop that in the chat. Or if you have any ideas or thoughts of what might be a protected class, I'd encourage you to go ahead and put that in the chat at this time. Is anyone familiar with any protected classes? Any disability, familial status, race, color, religion, national origin and disability, age, 40 and above, familial status. Fantastic, thank you so much. You all covered the majority of our protected classes. So you can see that there are some differences, but a lot of similarities between our federal and our state laws. So under the Federal Fair Housing Act, race, color, national origin, familial status, religion, and sex and disability are the 7 protected classes. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen that there are a lot of similarities. So, right, we've got race, color, national origin, familial status, religious creed, sex and disability, but we also add on age 40 and above, ancestry, as well as the use, handling, or training of support animals for disability. And I'm going to go into greater detail on a few of these. Familial status is defined as families with children under the age of 18 who are living with their parents or legal custodians. It includes people who are pregnant, as well as people who are securing custody of children under the age of 18. And that includes foster children as well as biological children. Now, there is an exemption for housing covered by the Housing for Older Persons Act. So there are some specific types of senior housing that would be allowed to limit families with children living in there. But in general, families with children under the age of 18 can't be limited from housing opportunities. I also want to touch on the protected class of sex under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. So you didn't see LGBTQ, sexual orientation, gender identity under our list of protected classes. However, PHRC finalized regulations in 2023 that establish that the term sex may refer to pregnancy status, childbirth status, breastfeeding status, sex assigned at birth, gender identity or expression, affectional or sexual orientation, as well as differences in sex development. So the Commission utilizes these regulations as we accept complaints, conduct investigations, and adjudicate cases. And we've got more information on our website at the link at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to learn more. We also have a really helpful fact sheet that's available on the website as well. Now, this is an area where there used to be consistency under the previous administration with the federal and the state in the way that we accept complaints. My understanding is that that HUD is not accepting complaints under the protected class of sex based on gender identity or sexual orientation. But if someone believes that they have experienced discrimination on any of the factors listed on the screen, they can file that under the protected class of sex at PHRC. And the last protected class that I want to cover in more detail is disability. So that's defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of a person's major life activities. Some examples include caring for oneself, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, or working. And our fair housing laws protect those who have a disability, who have a history of a disability, as well as those who are regarded as having a disability. So if a person has a disability that meets the definition on the screen, they would have protections. But if someone would be treated just discriminatorily, unfairly in their housing based on a housing provider's knowledge of their disability or because of how someone regards them, they also could file a complaint about that as well. There are two key exemptions that I want to highlight. So individuals who are currently using illegal drugs or controlled substances, they would be exempted from disability-related protection. That does not include those who are in active recovery. So folks who are in active recovery do have disability-related protections, but those that are currently using illegal drugs would not. And individuals who pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others would also be exempted from disability-related protections. I want to share with you some examples of discriminatory actions. It could be discriminatory statements, whether that's in an advertisement or whether it's in a conversation. Discriminatory inquiries about someone's protected class while they're seeking to rent or buy or get financing for a home. Steering to a certain neighborhood or a certain floor of a unit or a certain type of complex based on someone's protected class is discriminatory. Refusing to sell, lease, or finance housing, providing an unfair appraisal, predatory lending practices, and redlining, discrimination in housing terms and conditions. The terms and conditions of the lease and other policies, as well as unequal provision of services and facilities. So the way that maintenance is provided, the way that folks can access areas of the housing unit. Sexual harassment, as well as refusal to provide reasonable accommodations and modifications. All right, so that concludes our basic overview of fair housing laws. We certainly offer more extensive trainings on those laws in our fair housing fundamentals trainings, but I wanted to provide a basic overview so that way everyone's working from the same understanding. Now we're going to move into a more focused discussion on local governments and fair housing. So before I jump in, I want to open it up for discussion. So I'd love for folks to put in the chat about some ideas about ways that local governments can influence housing opportunities in their communities. What are the roles that local governments can play? And I will pause for a moment to allow folks to respond in the chat. All right, so I'm seeing some ideas, funding. Yeah, funding for housing opportunities, zoning decisions, absolutely. What are some other ways that local governments can influence housing opportunities in their communities? Housing programs, first-time local buyer grant programs, build affordable housing and projects, zoning, absolutely. And the policies, the way they're written and the way they're enacted, offering fair housing trainings for residents, I love that. Anything else? Any other ideas that folks have? Well, thank you all so much for contributing your thoughts and ideas to this discussion. The federal grants and education for home buying, absolutely, making sure that folks can finance their housing and understand the home buying process, absolutely. Well, local governments play a really key role in ensuring fair housing choice. And that there are several components to fair housing choice. So there's actual choice, which is the existence of realistic housing opportunities. There's protected choice. That's housing that can be accessed without discrimination. And then enabled choice. So realistic access to sufficient information regarding options so that any choice is informed. Looking more specifically at actual choice, there's a lot of barriers for Pennsylvanians to access housing options, particularly when we're looking at low-income Pennsylvanians. So there's insufficient housing options, particularly housing that's affordable to folks at low income levels and extremely low income levels. That leads to a lot of cost burdening for individuals, paying a really high proportion of their rent or their income on their rent or their mortgage, which leaves them open to housing insecurity because they don't have a lot of other funds to be able to meet the rest of their household needs. Uh, Inaccessible assistance programs. So just acknowledging that there's not enough funding to provide housing assistance to everyone who needs it when we're looking at both federal, state, and local funding. The majority of folks that would qualify for housing assistance just don't receive it. And it's really hard to get into programs like Section 8 or Housing Choice Voucher Program. Poor housing quality. So when we're looking at the habitability of a unit and repairs needed and the housing options that are healthy and safe for tenants. As well as insufficient tenant protection. So when things go wrong with the landlord-tenant relationship, whether it's related to payment or repairs needed or other communication, how tenants are able to navigate this, as well as acknowledging that homeownership is out of reach for many first-time home buyers. And we see that all of these issues have disparate impact on individuals in protected classes. So that's just a basic list. There are certainly many other barriers and issues. If anyone has anything that they would add to that list of barriers to actual choice, I'd encourage you to put that in the chat and add that to our discussion. Looking next at protected choice. Hundreds of Pennsylvanians file complaints of discrimination each year at PHRC, as well as at HUD and with local fair housing agencies. But we know that even more fail to file complaints because they don't know their rights, or they fear retaliation from housing providers, or their focus is primarily on getting and obtaining safe and stable housing for their families. We know that fair housing issues go beyond what's filed each year. And then looking at that third prong in fair housing choice, enabled choice. And we know that there's significant unmet need about information on how to access programs, services, and housing opportunities. Looking specifically at individuals with disabilities, there's often substantial barriers to accessing housing that meets their needs or getting the needed reasonable accommodations or modifications that's needed for them to use and enjoy their housing. So next we're going to talk about a few different aspects of how local governments can impact housing. Zoning was one that was mentioned several times in the chat already. And it's important to note that zoning decisions may not discriminate based on the projected cost of residents and or potential residents. So some potential fair housing issues that can arise around zoning policies and zoning decisions would be zoning or land use policies that treat housing that may be occupied by protected classes as less favorable than housing that's occupied by other residents. It could look like blocking group homes or other projects that address housing needs for individuals in protected classes because of neighbor fears and prejudices. A term that's often used in zoning decisions is NIMBY, not in my backyard. So folks in a neighborhood that fear new residents that might be coming in or object to how that might change their neighborhood. Yep, and I see someone commented NIMBY in the chat as well. Absolutely. There's also a refusal to make reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities in land use and zoning policies and procedures, as well as requiring additional processes and delaying decisions when considering a dwelling that might be occupied by members of protected classes. So there can't be these additional barriers and procedures and hoops for these types of projects to go through, particularly when we know that these types of housing will be serving individuals in protected classes. Next up, I want to discuss occupancy standards. So localities often have their own occupancy standards, and these are in place to ensure health and safety of residents. Typically, it's going to be based on, the square footage or number of rooms per resident. And there's potential for fair housing issues to occur when occupancy standards and fair housing laws may come into conflict. So we see this primarily in terms of disparate impact on familial status, so families with children. It's important to note that property managers should not have standards that are more restrictive than the local governments, and the sex of children should not be considered in assessing the number of rooms needed. So they shouldn't be um, looking at whether it's boys and girls sharing a room versus boys and girls or other genders. And there is a fair housing resource that I want to point out. The Keating memo does provide some guidance on the interaction between local occupancy standards as well as fair housing laws. Next up, I'd like to talk about nuisance ordinances. So our nuisance or crime-free ordinances are intended to ensure that neighborhoods are safe. That's the stated purpose, but they can be problematic because they often prevent people from accessing needed law enforcement support. So these are ordinances that might say that someone in rental housing can't call police more than 3 times, and then the housing provider needs to evict them. But this can be a challenge because it keeps people from being able to access the help that they need. And we see this a lot around survivors of domestic violence. Um, so we see the disparate impact based on sex, because while certainly not all survivors of domestic violence are women, that predominantly impacts women. And therefore it's a fair housing issue. So the Violence Against Women Act, under the reauthorization in 2022, CDBG recipients are required to identify and report nuisance ordinances that would have that impact on survivors of domestic violence. And there's a fact sheet on there that's linked on the screen. So local governments have the responsibility to ensure that these types of ordinances are enacted only for legitimate, non-discriminatory reasons, and also focus on enforcement, making sure that they're not enforced in a way that would disproportionately affect members of protected classes. So local governments are often involved in code enforcement. Now, code enforcement is not uniformly uh, available throughout the state, but we know that poor housing conditions, unsafe housing conditions, often disproportionately impact individuals in protected classes and those without the resources to move to safe housing. So when there's substantial issues with, say, the heat or the plumbing or the electricity, that can really destabilize someone's housing and force them to quickly move or go into shelter, to couch surf in order to have safe housing. Now, the Pennsylvania implied warranty of habitability is certainly a protection for renters in Pennsylvania, but the resources and the steps are often insufficient for residents to remedy hazardous housing situations. So a lot of folks colloquially know repair and deduct or withholding rent, but there's a lot of important steps that someone needs to take before taking any of these steps to address housing concerns that housing providers are unwilling or unable uh, to address. And if it's done wrong, it can land them in court, and that can have future impacts on their housing as well. We know that rural municipalities are less likely to have code enforcement programs. 80% or 89% of rural municipalities have not adopted property maintenance codes that would enable someone with a housing issue to call and request an inspection to expedite the work in being done. But there's also concerns around fair code enforcement, making sure that it's implemented fairly and in a way that doesn't disadvantage certain tenants. And then there is a strategic code enforcement resource that is linked on the bottom of the screen there for future and further learning. Next up, I want to discuss reasons. So individuals with disabilities have the right to request reasonable accommodations that are needed to use and enjoy their housing. So a definition includes a change in policy, practices, or rules, policies, practices, or procedures that are needed in order to use and enjoy their housing. So we often talk about this in the rental housing space, so with landlords. So that could look like waiving pet rules, a no pet policy for someone that needs to have a service or a support animal to use and enjoy their housing. It could look like if someone receives income based on their disability that comes in after the rent is due, adjusting that due date to make sure that they can pay their rent on time each day of the month. It could look like the ability to have a live-in caregiver that lives with someone if that's needed because of someone's disability. So there's a wide spectrum of reasonable accommodations that can be requested for individuals with disabilities. But these reasonable accommodations sometimes are requested of local governments as well. So it's important that local government officials and staff have training on how to receive and process reasonable accommodation requests in a fair and timely manner. So some examples of these accommodation requests that might come to a local government would be designated reserved parking on the street. So maybe this parking is typically available to any resident, but a resident would request reserved parking because of their disability. And that's something that should be accommodated if they provide supporting documentation. This also could look like a reasonable accommodation request in zoning to allow for a group home, whether that's for individuals in recovery or individuals with developmental disabilities that would be living together in a setting out in the community. They could run into an issue with single-family zoning, and they could request that change in policy or rule to allow them to be able to live out in the community. And there is a resource linked from the Housing Equality Center on reasonable accommodations with some more information. So how do we advance fair housing choice in our communities? It's important that everyone receive fair housing training, make sure that they're keeping up to date with fair housing knowledge, being able to identify the key housing barriers that are impacting individuals in protected classes, identifying partners in the communities and focusing on developing those relationships. So this is not something that local governments can do on their own, but they should look at the agencies and organizations that are serving communities in protected classes to make sure that they understand that the housing needs and how policies can impact these individuals. Being conscious about how we're framing housing needs and issues. So we talked about opposition to a lot of housing development that can come about. So using terminology and phrasing and creating space for conversations to allow folks to understand how these projects are meeting housing needs in our communities and how it's going to benefit the community as a whole, as well as connecting with other local efforts throughout the state, as well as statewide and national efforts. And building a broad coalition is going to make your efforts much more powerful. So making sure that you've got folks with lived experience, individuals from a wide variety of protected classes, as well as housing providers that are active in your area, municipal leaders and officials, planners, developers, community development finance institutions, CDFIs, social service providers, as well as disability advocates, folks with fair housing knowledge and expertise, as well as others. So I know we've got some folks that are directly from local governments on this training today. So some best practices for you all include providing fair housing training to your staff and elected officials, making this fair housing education and resources available to housing providers and residents in your area, making sure that you've got policies for handling reasonable accommodation requests and making sure that anyone that might be receiving these requests knows how to handle that and get them to the appropriate folks. Examine your ordinances and how they're implemented through a fair housing lens, making sure that these policies aren't having disparate impact on individuals in protected classes, as well as taking steps to ensure that individuals in protected classes have a voice as you're doing local planning. For folks of you that are not in local government at present, but you are engaging with local governments, there's ways for you to get involved as well in making sure that that your government is meeting the fair housing needs in your area. So it starts with showing up, attending zoning and planning meetings so you know what's happening, you know the decisions that are being made. Being aware of your local codes, ordinances, and plans. Advocating for zoning changes that increase opportunity for a diversity of housing choices, whether that's accessory dwelling units, ADUs, zoning by right, reduced parking minimums and site requirements, reduced fees and expedited reviews for affordable housing. So removing those barriers that keep additional housing from being built. Supporting affordable housing projects in your community, particularly those that are seeking to meet unmet housing needs, focusing on individuals in protected classes. Requesting reasonable accommodations when that's needed for group homes, and then reporting fair housing issues when you become aware of them, whether that's to PHRC, to HUD, or to a local Human Relations Commission. And I want to close out our discussion today with a quick review of the complaint process at PHRC. So if you're aware of a fair housing issue, if you believe you've experienced discrimination, please reach out. That starts by contacting one of our regional offices, the one that's nearest you, or you can call our main number. You can go on our website and fill out a fair housing complaint form. You can email us. There's lots of different ways to get in touch with us. But you will connect with our intake team and be asked to fill out a housing questionnaire, providing your contact information, what you experienced, and who you're filing against. And it's the intake team's responsibility to assess this information to see if it's a situation that PHRC can investigate under our state law, so under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. If this complaint is jurisdictional and timely, then the intake team will help you to finalize the complaint, and then the person who was filed against will be notified as well. And then the complaint moves into the investigation phase. So both parties will be asked to provide information to a neutral investigator who's responsible for investigating if there was a violation of our state law. So our investigators may ask for documentation, they may interview witnesses, they may hold a fact-finding hearing, they may go on site or seek other ways of obtaining information. We also have a really fantastic mediation team here, and mediation services might be an option, depending on the facts of the case and if both parties agree to mediation. It's completely voluntary, but it can be a way to resolve a complaint quickly and confidentially. But if mediation isn't elected or isn't successful, the investigator will also explore if it's possible to settle a case before coming to a finding. If the case proceeds through the investigation to a finding, there's two potential outcomes. So probable cause means that there was enough evidence to determine that discrimination occurred. And no probable cause means there wasn't enough evidence to determine that discrimination occurred. If no probable cause is found, that's pretty much where that ends, unless that decision is appealed. If probable cause is found, then the case may be conciliated, it may advance to public hearing, or be filed in court. And at this point, the goal is to seek a remedy for the discrimination that occurred. The amount of time that it can take to investigate a case really can vary based on the evidence, the speediness of responses, as well as other factors. So why would someone go through all of the steps of investigation and filing a complaint? There are some remedies that can be achieved. So if a reasonable accommodation or modification was denied and that was the reason for the complaint, a reasonable accommodation or modification can be made. Maybe there were unfair lease terms or other policies of a housing provider or of a local government. There can be a requirement to make changes to these policies to ensure that that everyone being served has equal housing opportunities. Oftentimes there's a posting of fair housing notices to make sure that everyone is aware of their rights and responsibilities, as well as training for respondents, so the person who was filed against, to make sure that they are fully aware of their responsibilities. There are also financial remedies, which include potentially reimbursement of fees and out-of-pocket expenses, as well as money for humiliation and embarrassment, which is similar to pain and suffering. And this is only available in our housing and commercial property cases, not in education and employment and public accommodations. Lastly, if a case would proceed to a hearing, civil penalties may be assessed as well. And I want to provide a few examples of fairly recent housing awards. So the first one was a $1.5 million case where a housing provider failed to provide accessible units and ignored requests for reasonable accommodations for tenants with disabilities. A $100,000 case where a maintenance worker sexually harassed a female tenant. $90,000 where a housing provider revoked a lease and failed to address neighbor harassment based on race, as well as a $77,000 case where a housing provider made discriminatory statements and refused to rent to a household based on familial status. So you can see that housing discrimination still continues to occur. We do receive a variety of complaints, many different protected classes and discriminatory actions, and there are some significant findings. Now, if you have questions and run into issues after our training today, I want to encourage you to take advantage of some of the fair housing resources that we have available. So we have a fair housing line that you can call in and ask questions and get directed to fair housing information and resources. We have a quarterly fair housing newsletter that's emailed out each quarter to keep you up to date with upcoming trainings and resources and changes. We do offer free housing training programs that we can provide to your organization, your agency. We also have additional webinars, Fair Housing and Power Hour sessions like we have today. We'll be releasing our flyer for the upcoming sessions throughout the end of the year very shortly. We've got written materials, brochures, and fact sheets. We also we hosted a show on PCN TV. It's called PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing Forward, and we've got the full archive of episodes on our YouTube channel. Lastly, we've got a white paper that's called The State of Fair Housing in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We published it back in 2023, looking a lot at the barriers to fair housing that we covered in today's session, and it makes recommendations on steps that PHRC as well as other actors in the state should do to make sure that we're actually ensuring that folks can access fair housing opportunities. We are looking to release an update of that with new information and recommendations later this fall. I also want to share our contact information. I do want to note that starting next week, we will have a new email or a new mailing address for our central office. I like to ask Director Griffin to pop that in the chat so that way we can share that most updated one with you as we're moving offices. We've got our